Good morning, colleagues, esteemed guests, friends of ASSAf, and most especially our celebrants this morning, Dr. Dariusz Dziewanski. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all on this very special day. My name is Naomi Nkiela, and I'll be your host this morning. We note apologies from Susan Felsman and Ina Smith for this event because they both had to attend a DSI meeting at the same time. I think I wouldn't be wrong to say we will have more fun here than they will have at their meeting. But colleagues, we're here to celebrate Dr. Dziewanski's wonderful achievement as co-winner of the Humanities Book Award in the category of Emerging Researcher. As the core business of this celebration, we will listen to Dr. Dziewanski talk to us about his book. But before I talk about the award itself and invite Dr. Dziewanski to take the digital stage, I would like to state some house rules for attendance. Please keep your camera turned off and your microphone muted unless invited to speak by the program facilitator. You can type questions in the chat box as the lecture proceeds. You're also welcome to raise your hand during the discussion session, but please remember to put it down again when you finish talking. Do you experience technical difficulties? We will do our best to assist you. But do try a full device restart or log out and log in again and make sure your speaker volume is turned up. Let's talk about the Humanities Book Awards, the ASSAf Humanities Book Awards. The ASSAf Humanities Book Award is presented to a writer of a scholarly, with emphasis, well-written work of nonfiction, published up to 3 years prior to its nomination. The book should be noteworthy in its contribution to developing new understanding and insight of a topic in the humanities. The first award was announced in 2017, and it was given to Professor Keith Breckenridge. He won the prize for his book, Biometric States, The Global Politics of Identification and Surveillance in South Africa, 1850 to the present. Second book prize was awarded in 2021 to Professor Charles van Onselen for his book titled The Night Trains Moving Mozambican Miners to and from South Africa, circa 1902 to 1955. ASSAf awards these prizes biennially for scholarly publications that make outstanding and exemplary contributions to scholarship in the humanities, social sciences, or the performing arts. For 2022, ASSAf received 49 nominations, 31 for the established researcher category and 18 for the emerging researcher category, with the publication dates limited to 2019, 2020, and 2021. The Academy announced its winners for the Humanities Book Prize Awards on 30 March 2023, and the ceremony was hosted at the Vineyards Hotel in Cape Town. The awards comprise 2 categories, the Emerging Researcher Award and the More Established Researcher Award. Now, let's look at our winners for 2023. Professor Leslie Green from the University of Cape Town received the award in the category of Established Researcher for her book, Rock, Water, Life, Ecology and Humanities for a Decolonial South Africa. Some of you were here the last time when Professor Green spoke to us about her book. The Emerging Researcher category, the award was jointly given to Dr. Dariusz Dziewanski from the University of Cape Town for his book, Gang Entry and Exit in Cape Town, Getting Beyond the Streets in Africa's Deadliest City, and to Dr. B. Kaminga from the University of the Witwatersrand for the book, Transgender Refugees and the Emerging South Africa, Bodies Over Borders and Borders Over Bodies. What a title, beautiful. With regard to honorable mentions in the established researcher category, 2 candidates received honorable mentions. Professor Louise Green for her book titled Fragments from the History of Loss, the Nature Industry and the Post-Colony, and Professor Tina Steiner for her book titled Convivial Worlds, Writing Relation from Africa. In the emerging researcher category, Dr. Rick de Villiers from the University of the Free State was the sole shortlisted candidate for his book titled Eliot and Beckett's Slow Modernism, Humility and Humiliation. Now, all three shortlisted candidates were invited to attend the award ceremony that happened in March this year. Who were the people behind all of this work? Of course, you would appreciate that much work goes into adjudicating such a prestigious award. For that reason, we would like to publicly acknowledge the hard work of the adjudication panel, as well as the ASSAf team that supported them. So the adjudication panel members were Professor John Higgins from the University of Cape Town, Professor Zetu Matebeni from the University of Fort Hare, Professor Nklanklam Pofu, who is now at Stellenbosch, Professor Siona O'Connell from University of Pretoria, Professor Vasu Reddy, who is now at the University of the Free State, Professor Neil Rose, who is at the University of Fort Hare, Professor Crane Sudien, who has two affiliations, Nelson Mandela University and University of Cape Town, and yours truly, my humble self. The ASSAf team that worked with us comprised of Mrs. Susan Feltzman, who is the director of the Scholarly Publishing Program, Mrs. Mapoti Ramete, who is the project officer of the Scholarly Publishing Program, and of course, Professor Himla Sudia, who is the executive officer of ASSAf. We extend great appreciation to all of them for supporting the team that adjudicated this award during the process and beyond. This lecture series, how did it come about? Subsequent to the awards ceremony, the Humanities Book Selection panel decided to host a series of lectures to provide award recipients with a platform to discuss their journeys, motivations behind their books, societal impacts of their work, and personal influences. This lecture series aims to amplify recognition of the exceptional scholarly contributions made by the awardees. And that's why we're here. So that's why we're celebrating Dr. Dziewanski's book on gang entry in Cape Town. The book adds to gang literature in Cape Town by exploring the possibility of disengagement, pushing back on the overwhelming focus on gang entry and participation among gang scholars here. For policymakers, activists, community workers, and others, it shows that there is a way out of gangs, even though a difficult one, and it tries to provide some insight into what the way out might be. Theoretically, it adds to the practical elements of street cultural scholarship inspired by French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Like gangs, street culture too is often portrayed as having no escape. Life histories in the book show that's not true. But the way out is not easy. By relying on life histories and deep ethnographic research to explore the topic of disengagement from gangs and street culture, the book can also accurately portray how difficult it is to get out and stay out of gangs. It also provides a more human and more empathetic account of a topic that is often dealt with neither much humanity nor empathy by politicians, the media, and the general public. And you can read the full review of this by Professor John Higgins that was published in the Daily Maverick. So we come to the point where we need to introduce our celebrants, Dr. Dariusz Dziewanski. He is a social scientist whose research focuses on gangs in Cape Town. Based on this work, he has written a book on gang entry and exit and published on street culture in a number of peer-reviewed journals. The book is what we're celebrating today. He also has 15 years of experience carrying out research, projects, and evaluations in diverse international development and humanitarian settings around the world. As a journalist, Dariusz has written features and editorials for Al Jazeera, The Guardian, The Globe and Mail, and many other media outlets. Dariusz holds a doctorate from SOAS, University of London, and is currently an honorary research affiliate of the Center of Criminology in the Faculty of Law at the University of Cape Town. Dr. Dziewanski, you now have our undivided attention. Welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that glowing and gracious welcome. And thank you to ASSAf for putting on this event and allowing me the opportunity, obviously, to present my work. As an academic, I have sort of an interesting relationship with academia. So in a way, partly to describe this setting, I'm actually giving this lecture from Kampala in Uganda, where I'm running an evaluation of a World Food Program policy that they're piloting here. And so all of this to say, I am not an academic that somehow is typically and sort of actively engaged in the topic that I'm an expert in. In fact, right now I'm immersed in the world of smallholder farmers and agriculture. So you'll have to bear with me if sort of my fluency and fluidity with some of the theories and the topic that I've spent so much time on researching and obviously writing a book is not something that is sort of foremost of mind, but it's given me a really interesting opportunity to dive back into something that I've spent a lot of time on, have worked hard on, and I'm proud of, and even more so, I think, an opportunity to present that to you. So thank you very much for your interest in this, and hopefully I'll do the stories that I've collected justice and the book justice in presenting it through the lecture and then subsequently through the discussion. So I think the best way to do this is not to focus on me and my hideous hotel background, but to present a bit of a presentation. So let me just share my screen and we'll work through some of the main aspects of my research, and then we'll use that as an entry point into discussion. So hopefully everybody can see my screen here. I think you can. So yeah, my book deals with gang entry and exit in Cape Town. So it's essentially divided into two parts, but the second part is probably the most important part, the disengagement exit part. There's not a lot of scholarship on this, and generally in gang literature, it's also something that has been ignored, or at least relatively speaking, to entry and participation. But before I get into the actual sort of meat of my research and findings, I think it makes sense just to set a little bit of background. I think most people are familiar with the issues related to gangs and gang violence in Cape Town. I mean, it's something that is in public discourse. It's something that is in political discourse. It's something that obviously also exists in the media, with stories being told of gang shootings and killings. As sad as that is, it happens on a weekly, if not daily basis. But I think that not a lot of people are familiar with some of sort of the nuances of gang typologies and some of the estimates around gangs and stuff. So maybe I could just use that as a way of laying the foundation for our subsequent discussion. And so Cape Town has the infamous title of Africa's deadliest city, and it's had that title for now, I think, 5 or 6 years running. And basically this means that it's got the highest murder rate in all of Africa. And so according to these listings, which look at cities worldwide, Cape Town, I think, according to murders, the statistics of murders per capita, was 12th in the world. And so it exists rather inauspiciously amongst cities like Ciudad Juarez and Baltimore, which are famous and, well, infamous for their gang violence. And so I think one of the important things to understand in the relationship between gang violence and violence in general in Cape Town is that it's not necessarily always the cities with the most prominent gang problems, at least as it relates to sort of the biggest and most well-known and institutionalized gangs that actually have the highest murder rates. That said, gang-related violence is a contributing factor to homicide in the city, as well as other forms of violence. And so at the time of writing my book, the estimates were that gang-related violence accounts for something between 1/4 and 1/3 of killings. And I think the important thing to talk about this is, there's a huge focus on violence, but just to foreground the discussion, and this will come out subsequently in the discussion, is, violence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has antecedents, it has drivers, and it's important to understand the reasons that people get into gangs and then participate in gang activities. And so, in communities where you have a lack of basic services, including policing, you have a lack of job opportunities, communities that are segregated from the mainstream and the city center and everything that's associated with that, especially as it relates to economic opportunities. People turn to other forms of empowerment, other forms of income, other forms of protection, and gangsterism is one of those. And so it's also important to say that, the vast majority of people in the communities that I worked in obviously do not become gang members. And there are many other forms of empowerment and finding your way and identity and a sense of belonging in any one community, including the communities that I researched in. But gangs are a prominent sort of social group, and they do set the tone in many ways for community life. And so you can see there estimates in terms of the numbers of gang members and the amount of gangs. These are kind of antiquated and disputed estimates, but it's the best that we have. Gang violence and gangs are a hidden topic and something that is difficult to research and difficult to define. So there is no pre-existing and agreed upon definition of gangs that criminologists and other gang scholars agree on internationally. And even in Cape Town, you can see that there's many different types of gang typologies, from cliques and crews, which are much smaller. They can be loose affiliations around criminal activities, or maybe more cohesive groups that have an identity that control a block in a community, to prison gangs, which used to exclusively exist in prison. So some people might be familiar with the number, the 26s, the 27s, 28s. They have their own arcane mythology and iconography and even language. But in the 1990s, prison gangs started to kind of meld with the street, and now they exist also in the street outside of prison as sort of self-contained street gangs that are extension of prison gangs. And so I will be focusing on street gangs in colored communities, although prison gangs in the number will come out a little bit in the course of the discussion. But what these gangs they are sort of more formalized, more professionalized, more institutionalized forms of gangs. And so they might be franchised across communities. You might know names like the Americans, the Mongrels, the Laughing Boys. They exist not in one area, not in one block, but they might control a large part of a community or a large part of multiple communities. They have a structure which is relatively well defined. They have a certain formality to them, and some of them have evolved into what so-called super gangs. So the Americans and the Hard Livings, these gangs are bordering on sort of organizational criminal enterprises. Although it must be understood that sort of at the street level, we are still talking about like largely impoverished foot soldiers that exist at or below the poverty line, that essentially work at the best of gang bosses which exploit them. So even when we're talking about criminal enterprises that are relatively formalized and franchised across the city, that there is still a great sort of a wide array of experiences and forms of participation in those. And so, as I said before, the book presents the first area, or it presents sort of two main topics. One is gang entry and participation, and the other one looks at the modes and motivations and strategies related to disengagement. And so I'll present a bit the methodology that I use, just so you know how my research is motivated and how it unfolded. And we'll talk about street culture, which sets up sort of the theoretical framework and the gang entry and participation part. And then we'll break from street culture to look at disengagement and present some preliminary conclusions. So the methodology was a long-term research project that spanned the course of 2013 to 2018. It was ethnographic research, so it focused on formal qualitative interviews around 24 life histories. And so basically looking at people's early experiences, sort of their histories growing up and how that contributed, and sort of the social circumstances that they lived in contributed into them entering into gangs, their participation in gangs, and their subsequent exit from gangs. And so all of the 24 life histories that I focused on were gang members that had been out of gangs for at least a year, but some had been out for far longer, up to 10 years. And so I think one of the interesting aspects of this research is, out of those 24 life histories, because my research project was such a long project, these life histories came in the form of interviews towards the end of that project, but I actually knew or had known many of the key informants for a period of time. And so I had the opportunity to speak to them, their family, interact with them in their communities. And I think more importantly, get a sense of what life is like, and the daily struggles of gang participation, and more importantly, subsequently, how arduous, how dangerous, how lengthy and non-linear gang exit is. And I think that really gave me a sense of not just people's experiences, but how to approach a topic like this with more humanity, in a way that is personalized and gets at the depth of people's experiences, and I think is better able to portray those hopefully to the reader. And so the 24 gang members or ex-gang members that I interviewed came from a variety of gangs: Americans, Mongrels, Laughing Boys, Ghetto Kids, and others. They came from different communities across Cape Town, Manenberg, Hanover Park, Grassy Park, Delft, Mitchell's Plain, and other communities. And this was then complemented by many other interviews with other gang members, their family members, friends, policymakers, researchers, as well as, and most importantly, I think, just hours of discussion and observation in different communities. And so, while I understand that I'm a tourist and somebody that can opt out of life in that community or in any one community and return to, my privilege, comfort, and security in central Cape Town, being in different communities for long periods of time did at least give me some sense of what life is like there, and what the people that my research focused on were dealing with. And I think that hopefully came through in the research and the way that this book was presented, which was in a journalistic style format. And so rather than just using big chunks of quotes, what I tried to do is kind of paint pictures, or give a sense of context, of the different characters, and the way that their lives kind of interweaved, not in a personal sense, but through their experiences, and how these then connected to the theories that I was exploring. And so hopefully this will come out a little bit in the presentation, in the way that I talk about some of these issues just through tangible examples of people's lives. So just to give you a sense of the theoretical construct that I used, I focused on street culture. So street culture is something that is connected to gangs and gang organization and gang participation, but it is not exclusive to it. So it's a form of practices, actions, sort of skills that have been called different things, from the code of the street to the mindset of Lakura to defiant individualism. And essentially what it is an aggressive form of defiance and identity that's formed in relation to and in contrast to the mainstream. And so it grows out of exclusion in places and in social spaces that are marginalized and don't have access to the types of resources and opportunities that are available to those people in mainstream or in dominant society. And it's usually focused around hypersensitivity, aggression, violence. And these are practices that some people turn to as a way of gaining a competitive advantage and accessing some of those things that I spoke about earlier: protection, income, dignity, empowerment. And so I think, as I said, it's important to understand that the vast majority of people never join gangs, but gang members do set the tone for life in a community in a particular way. And so they present what is called a street repertoire, which is essentially a mode of action or a strategy of action that role models how you might get sort of the basic elements of life as you want them, right? So if you see somebody on the corner in your community where people act deferentially to them, or they have a certain amount of power over somebody else, or they're wearing nice clothing, or they have access to money, or they're driving a nice car. The way that they speak, the way that they dress, the way that they act provides a model, a template, a blueprint for how you yourself or some person might also attain all of these things. And so what I did in terms of my street cultural section is I broke down street culture into speaking street, dressing street, and acting street. And this will come out a little bit in the example that I give, but speaking street, it relates to slang that's used, Sabella, which is a prison language, a certain aggressive tone, all of these things. The key informants that I spoke to expressed are an indication of your affiliation with a certain type of group, a certain type of lifestyle. They're an indication that you're a person that's to be respected, to be feared, etc. Dressing street. So we and again, this isn't particular necessarily to gang members, but wearing techies, wearing tracksuits, silver chains, earrings, things like this. And then most importantly, acting street, which is oriented around being, crazy, wild, aggressive, taking risks, all of these things. And so some people without access to mainstream opportunities turn to this sort of street repertoire as a strategy for gaining empowerment, respect, etc. And street cultural theorists have found that these are sort of commonalities in the practices of street culture and sort of the repertoires of street culture that have been found all over the world, right? In marginal spaces, informal spaces, peripheral spaces, ghettos, favelas, slums, and all of these connect to Cape Town through, this common model that exists. And in my book, I actually even go into other sort of gang-like groups, armed groups across the African continent, looking at street youth and how they mobilize, terrorist organizations, militias, and different types of groups. And they have different structures, different motivations, but they have the commonality that all in some way are born out of marginalization and access, violence and criminality as a way of sort of opposing that structural oppression. And so the most important or the most interesting to me types of street cultural research borrow from Pierre Bourdieu. And so they adapt ideas like cultural capital, field, and habitus into their own sort of social theory. So where Bourdieu has been particularly good is showing how inequality and segregation connects and is reproduced through exclusion or social and cultural exclusion. So generally this idea that inequality is an economic phenomenon exclusively, whereas he shows that, if you're segregated into a particular space and you don't have access to privileged spaces which have their own way of speaking and dressing and referring to things socially, you will then subsequently be further excluded from economic opportunities. And not to say that one place is better than the other, or one social setting is not to moralize, I guess, this dichotomy, but there is a reality that if you haven't grown up and been accessing certain privileged spaces, gone to certain schools, you will not be privy to some of those forms of cultural capital just because you have not been inculcated into them over time. And so I think a job interview is probably a good example of that. If you're lucky enough to be able to access that job interview, probably you might not have the networks that allow you to do that. But if you go into it dressed a particular way and speaking a particular way, and referring to not being able to sort of access common pop cultural references or cultural reference, not having come from the same school or being parts of the same groups, you will be discriminated against, and your economic well-being will be affected. And so what Bourdieusian street cultural theory does is it essentially sets up, borrowing from Bourdieu's concepts, a parallel theory which looks at cultural capital that exists in the streets, which are the skills, knowledge, and styles that relate to places that are sort of informal, exist oftentimes in around criminal economy. So from the drug economy to other sort of illicit economies, and gang members are perhaps the prototype of how that's activated. And so again, we're talking about crazy behavior, reckless behavior, risk-taking, things like this. And in social spaces that have their own rules around, what is appropriate and what isn't, and we'll see that from the next example. People are constantly jockeying for position, right? Respect, power, status. And so the way that you're able to not just embody aggressiveness, but like your ability to understand a criminal market, so a drug market, your ability to source guns, your ability to to organize a gang and lead a gang, all of these things are forms of street capital. And so it earns you respect, it earns you standing, and all of that positions you better in terms of even being able to access income, things like this. And street habitus is essentially the long-term engagement with some of these practices and dispositions, and it shows how they become embodied over periods of time, and how they keep people trapped and communities trapped in cycles of poverty, violence, etc. And so just a quick example here from one of my key informants. Obviously, the name has been changed, but this takes place in Weinberg Magistrates Court. And so basically, he is at this point, I think he was a junkie funky, later switched to the Corner Boys, and he got basically called up to the judge for a charge or a series of charges. And the judge presented to him sort of a proposition asking, what should I do, or give me a reason why I should be lenient. And instead of giving that reason, which I think most of us would, in the expectation or in the hope that we would have a more lenient sentence, he realized, or his sort of thought process was, okay, I'm in this court setting, which is a very prominent setting where there's a lot of sort of gang members come through, or their families, or whatnot. People are looking, and so he needed to present this facade, even though he knew that it would make it more likely that he would end up in prison, and end up in prison for a longer time. And so this recklessness, this sort of acts of crazy defiance are something that you could see are valorized in a way that is obviously contrary to the way that it's seen in polite society. And already here you get a sense of how, law or sort of deterrence-based approaches and policies based around law and order, and creating laws that are stricter and greater policing, how that might not necessarily act as a deterring force for somebody who exists in a moral universe, where competitive advantage is defined by seeking out a prison sentence. And in fact, joining the number and spending time in prison is something that is seen as a rite of passage and increases your standing. Just one sort of other example here. So once Ruan did join the Corner Boys, recklessness and sort of that extreme aggression is actually a good business practice. And so he was somebody that ran drugs for the gang, and then also had to collect on drug debts. And so he would talk about how he would smash somebody's face in with a hammer for 60 Rand, because it's something that acts as a deterrent to somebody else who might renege on a debt, and it makes his life easier as a debt collector. And I think the anecdote that really brought this home for me is that he was very close to the leader of the Corner Boys, and the one of the other Corner Boys members was the cousin of the leader. And at one point, the cousin was quite high up, and he ended up taking a big stash of drugs and just smoking it away over a weekend bender. And the gang leader came and tasked Ruan with punishing him for doing this. And he basically took a baseball bat and broke both of his legs. And the way that process unfolded, he understood that this is just part of the game. And what's really interesting is the victim, the cousin that had smoked away these drugs, also understood this, and they reconciled after he healed, and they actually ran the territory and sold drugs together after that incident, which goes to show that these types of rules and an understanding for the game and the rules of that particular social field, street field, are well understood both by perpetrators and victims. And so you can imagine how constantly being around violence, criminalization, dislocation from families, all of these things would create a situation where it would keep people locked into the streets. And so street scholars have been very good at showing how oppositional reactions and the different types of street cultural practices, how they connect to structural conditions, and how they are in a way a rational response to irrational circumstances. But most of street cultural literature has focused on why people get into gangs and street culture and how they stay trapped into it. And street culture is not so good at showing how social transformation is possible away from gangs and violence. And so in some of my other work, I've gone to show how street culture can be adapted. For example, it's seen as a typically masculine thing, but girl gang members or female gang members can adapt it in their own ways, accessing street repertoires, not because they are examples of masculinity, but they are examples of power. And so in a way, it kind of flattens questions of gender identity while considering them alongside other forms of the circumstances that people get into and the participating gangs. And then other research also looks at how gang norms and street cultural norms are upended in a way that gives them a sense of malleability and dynamism that doesn't otherwise exist in street culture. And we can perhaps get into that a little bit in terms of the discussion, because it is a bit, I guess, complicated, just the way that it relates to Bourdieusian theory. But yeah, I think all of this to say that there is limited scholarship on gang disengagement. Prior to this book, there was basically just indirect observations made about leaving gangs. I ended up writing a paper on gang exit as role transition, which is slightly different than the street cultural lens. But other than that, there isn't really that much of a focus on gang disengagement. So it really does kind of create this idea that there is no way out. And so I looked at, in situations where people are still marginalized, in communities that are still segregated, where they don't have access to mainstream sort of opportunities, where do they get their bits of sort of social and cultural capital? And so the research participants that I spoke to presented something called normal life, which was presented in opposition to street life. And it was usually a combination of domestic life, professional life, and religious life. And obviously all of these provide you with personal and sort of social benefits. But what's interesting to me, in the same way that acting street, speaking street, and dressing street are a performance, there was also a performative element to these different aspects of normal life. And so let me go through the different elements a little bit, and I see that I'm running out of time, so maybe I'll skip past domestic life and move into professional life. But it's obvious how being in a stable work setting, having money, gives you a sense of purpose, takes you away from the gang, but it also on some level also shows that to other gang members that, if you're able to hold a steady job and keep at that job for a period of time, that you're no longer a threat to that gang. Enemies will see that. Also, people in your community will see that your transition is to be trusted. But the problem is that it's first of all very difficult for most people to access employment, steady employment. The vast majority of those I interviewed had precarious work, to the extent that they had work at all. And then when they got into the work setting, there were dispositions that they had sort of been socialized into and had lived in for a period of time that were very difficult to let go of, right? And so their early experiences were that there was this real dislocation between the way that they had been used to acting, so aggressive, in power, not taking orders but giving orders, and suddenly you're in a situation that calls for something completely different. And so the sort of de-dispositioning process was very difficult and took a long period of time, and oftentimes it was punctuated by sort of confrontations where some people were lucky enough and sort of had the presence of mind to walk away from. And so I remember that there was one conversation that I had with one of my key informants, and he'd be working, I think, as part of like an electrical company for a period of time, and he had an argument with his boss, and he said, well, I almost hit him over the head with a spade, but I had to walk away from that and just leave the workspace for a couple of days while I cooled down. And so, for the vast majority of people, that would not be seen as a victory, because this is something that you would come to expect. But if you come from a world where you're used to acting a particular way, and in fact, the rules within that sort of moral universe or social space call for a certain type of action, then it's very difficult to come to an understanding and get used to a completely different set of circumstances. And so we can see here from the quotes of Declan that very early on in his work on a farm, he had this confrontation with one of his bosses, and his initial reaction was just to stand up, fight somebody, fight his boss, and take his bags and go. And this was related to his street persona, which is often embodied in a particular nickname. And so when people talk about their past selves, they will be called, the devil, or they will be called some other thing which represents everything that they were there. And they see the break in their identity now as a return to the person that they were, so that they are now. So now it would be sort of this dichotomy created between the devil and Declan. And so he was saying how hard it was to kind of move away from that past persona, and how arduous that process was. And I think, that there's something to be learned here in terms of how employment strategies are undertaken and sort of reintegration is approached, showing how difficult that is, and how much sort of empathy, understanding, and time is needed in order to help a person sort of reintegrate into a work setting. I think one of the most interesting aspects of the research was religious life and the religious repertoire. And so I think for a long time, I wasn't sure how to approach this. I mean, obviously, religion provides opportunities for absolution. It provides a script to live by. It provides a community to tap into, some of these things that family provides for as well. But there is also a real sort of performative element, right? And so you have an instance here that somebody's life is threatened, where basically they're in Hanover Park. They unfortunately walk around the corner, run into a couple of their past enemies, and almost get killed. So they're facing a situation that shows you how difficult it is and how dangerous it is to get out of gangs where death is literally around the corner. But then the reaction to that is, well, I can't retaliate, because imagine if I retaliate, then I'm back in it. And it's not just that practically you're back into a gang war, but people will start to perceive you a different way. And so Byron became a born-again Christian, and in the context of our conversations, it was obvious and explicit that he said, well, born-again Christians don't act like this, and so I must sit here and take what comes, even if that is potential violence enacted on him, because that's what somebody like me is expected to, but more to the point, that's what other people expect somebody like me to do. And so the new sort of identity has been created in opposition as a way of distancing himself from his membership in the mongrels through his religiosity. And so it was quite extreme, actually, in terms of the things that had to be foregone. And so no more partying, no more drinking, even though I posed to him the question, like, well, there's plenty of non-gang members that do all of these things. But he says, as you're transitioning outside of gangs, it's important that you stay sort of true to that transition, because there was a high level of skepticism, and people are highly dubious of that transition, and they expect you to fail. And so sort of any indication that you're not absolutely true to that transition is something that people will see as an indication of you potentially still being a gang member and associated with that particular persona. So that means, you take off your earrings, techies, whatever, you dress a completely different way. And for him, it was even it went as far as changing the music that you listen to. So he's like, I won't listen to Lil Wayne anymore. Now I'm listening to gospel music. And then this links to that dedispositioning process where you're starting to think a certain way. And all of it is interrelated. Other people would say, okay, well, I was in this new life, but still not just my old sort of issues related to anger and confrontation came up, but even the way that I thought around Sabella and how that's related to manipulation, and some of the rules around that came up. And so it is a very sort of long process that requires almost an absolute commitment internally, but also externally in terms of the way that people perceive you. And just in terms of some quick conclusions, I think one of the key takeaways is that, participation in street culture and gangs is a reaction to marginalization and injustice. And so agency is enacted as a survival mechanism. People often present gang membership in this like real sort of dichotomy between good and evil, and they associate the latter with gang members, sociopathy and some sort of disposition related to that, whereas if we see it sort of in the context of the social system, it's clear that it is far more complex than that simplistic notion of it, but that it has antecedents that are social, so segregation, discrimination, lack of opportunity. And so gang members get into that, or get into gangs as a way of in the short term, at the very least, trying to counter that marginalization. And so there is a Cape Flats motto that says getting into gangs is easy, but getting out of gangs is impossible. I think my work hopes to show that it's not impossible. It's just very difficult, and it takes time. I think that one of the as I said, the ways that my writing is, or one of the things that my writing is meant to get across, is just exactly how difficult it is. And sometimes, the disengagement process might not be complete. So for example, there was a gang member who I interviewed in Athlone, and he lived across the street from well-known Americans, a gang that he was a part of, and then he actually had some conflict with that particular the people that were living in that house. He ended up killing one of their family members, but the gang somehow settled that, and there was no retribution. But he was scared that he said that he had disengaged with the gang, but he still needed to fly the flag in a way. So we had our interview in his bedroom, or our interviews in his bedroom, and there was this massive Americans flag, and he said, well, I just need to keep this up because I'm not able to move out of my community, and I live in this Wendy house, which is something that my family allows me to do, but it's right across the street from an American's hideout. And so I need to present at the very least that I'm not a threat to them, and I'm not going to go join another gang, because this is what people often do. And so in the same way that gang members look to oppositional street cultural repertoires, ex-gang members look to the repertoires of normal life. And as I said, the constituent parts of this are domesticity, so family, work, and religion. So I think that there needs to be an incorporation of an understanding of how people get out, and the different social and cultural tools that they use when they get out in disengagement programs. And so I think disengagement programs are essential to helping individuals getting out of gangs. International research or evaluations and best practices indicate that disengagement programs that simultaneously help people in different aspects of their life. So they offer psychosocial support, cognitive behavioral therapy, educational support, economic support, different types of counseling. These are more likely to be effective. And given how prominent informal mechanisms are, family, community, religion, I think there is a real opportunity to bring these into social programs. Just given the fact that there is such a dearth of social programming and social development funds in many Cape Flats communities anyway, I think that there's an opportunity to leverage some of these informal mechanisms. Unfortunately, disengagement is a long process and often incomplete. As I mentioned with the Americans gang member that I just cited, I think there's also needs to be an understanding that disengagement is very important in changing individual lives, but there is further sort of evaluative research or evidence that looks at disengagement programs and their effects on gangs and gang structures, and they're good in terms of helping people get out of gangs, but that they will not sort of undermine the structures of gangs. So the gangs will persist because of all of those forms of structural oppression that I mentioned. There is a pipeline of ready and willing gang members to enter the gang. And so any long-term solution to gang violence and other gang-related issues requires larger structural reform. So reforms to address poverty, inequality, lack of housing, inadequate policing, lack of services. All of those are necessary in order to complement disengagement programs. So that is it for me. Thank you very much for your attention. I think that we have an opportunity for discussion. I see that I went over a little bit, but I tried to rush through parts of it, so we can pick up things that I didn't go into detail through the discussion. So thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dariusz. That was very super interesting. I mean, I read your book page by page. It was a wonderful read, very interesting. So I'm pleased that you're here to talk to us about it. All right, now let's hear from the people in the digital house. If there are some questions, but before I ask, before I give the floor to anybody to ask a question, please help me out here with one thing that has been puzzling me. What do you call a person who takes action to get out of a gang and stays out of a gang? I need an appropriate term. I've been toying with the term gang survivor, but it doesn't seem to capture it. What would you call that, Dariusz?
I mean, in my book, I call it an ex-gang member, a former gang member. It could be a gang survivor if we want to borrow from GBV literature.
Yeah, we need an appropriate term that actually captures the agency of this person, because like you do show, it's very hard, not just to do it, but also to sustain the exit. So maybe some more future research of yours should be looking in that direction. But thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Colleagues, let's hear your questions. You can raise your hand or you can put the question in there. We have one from Louise. Tell us how you gained the trust of the respondents to share their stories, and was it scary at times? Good question.
Yeah, so I think it took time. I wouldn't say that it was a difficult process necessarily, but the way that I engaged the communities that I worked in was obviously, you can't just walk into a place and expect somebody to share their secrets with you, especially when those stories and secrets are related to potential, criminal activities and things like this. And so my initial sort of form of validation was through organizations that worked in those communities that had the trust of community members. Often were working in areas related to gang prevention. And so that was my entry point. And then I would, in as much as I could, sort of volunteer some of my services to work with those organizations, to help them out with some of their systems, to also do kind of classes that bordered on participatory action research that touched on some of the things that I was researching. So talking about influences, structural factors that are driving people's participation in gangs, practices, what disengagement looks like, to get some of these, they were still gang members that were trying to transition to become ex-gang members or gang survivors. And over the course of these types of classes and engagement, we would just become friendly and you have that sort of organic tissue that binds people and creates a relationship between people. And so as they graduated out of rehabilitation programs and other programs that they were engaged in, they would go back to their communities, and I would maintain that relationship and that bond. And then just over the course of time, and some of what you're doing in ethnography isn't research in the way that we're used to understanding it, but it is just interaction between people. And so we're sitting and having food, or we're in a shebeen, or we're just walking around and talking. And over the course of time, then you start to fill in the particulars of what somebody's life looks like, and how that relates to some of the the different things that you're researching. And then that would obviously, with the 24 former gang members that I was researching with, that then was formalized in a series of questions and interviews that looked at different parts of their lives. And so all of that kind of came together in a way to kind of, to inform my research and methodology.
All right, Darius, two things. I'm going to pose Betsy's question to you, and then would you please reshare your slide so that you can talk to us about the domestic? You skipped a slide. So now we have the time for us to go through that. So Betsy would like to know whether the participants, your participants, have read your book.
So some of them have, yes. Unfortunately, just due to the way that my publication agreement has worked, I don't really have access to that many copies. And so those that were most involved have received copies of my book. And there is a hope now that there's a co-publishing agreement that is arranged with a South African university and distributor, and so we can better able to get the book to South Africa, because currently in hard copy it's very expensive and not really accessible. And at that point I'm going to make more of an effort because some have asked for it, and in lieu of an actual copy of my book, there's been like different times that I've presented this, and so different research participants or various research participants have come and witnessed those presentations, fed back on some of the research. I've sent chapters to them, and so it's not always possible to get the book, but there's different ways of engaging the people that were instrumental to this in a way that one shares the results of this to say, okay, well, we spent all this time and this is what came of it, but then also gets their input on the things that I've written and how I've interpreted the research that I've done, which has been very beneficial.
Thank you. We have a question from Ervin. Please ask your question before we...
Thank you. Darius, thank you for your book. I've actually read your book, and you've obviously launched the book at the Center for Criminology. And I'd like to ask you this particular question, and this relates to some of the leading gangsters, people such as Rashid Staghi, that also claimed he had become religious, changed his name to Richard, and was still involved in gangs afterwards. So what I'd like to ask you is, do you think if you were to redo your research today, and you do a longitudinal exercise with some of your participants, that you'd find some of them back in the gangs? I know it's a very difficult journey that you've been through, and I know that for the participants, some of whom I've met, it's been quite hard for them in their current context. So I'd like you to reflect on that, if you don't mind. Thanks.
Yes, the participants that I'm still connected to, for the most part, have not returned to gangs. That's not to say that there haven't been real tests in their journeys, which have not called into question necessarily, but created the circumstances where they might be pushed into gangs. And so I'm thinking specifically of two of my research participants. Both have been out for a very, very long period of time, and they had come to financial troubles, and those financial troubles just didn't end. They did eventually end, luckily, but they were without jobs and without income for years. So 1 year went by, 2 years went by, and as I continued to re-engage them, I would go back, for example, to one of their houses, and you can see that they have less and less furniture because they're having to sell off their furniture in order to make ends meet, right? There's the promise that funding might come from this project, or maybe they'll be able to get a job here, but they have quite serious criminal records. So even getting a job at somewhere like Pick and Pay to do essentially like relatively menial work, you're not able to do that because your criminal record comes up, and then you have considerations related to, okay, well, if I really get desperate, then do I borrow money from the gangs? If I borrow money from the gangs, then people call into question my disengagement. And if I'm not able to pay back that money, how then do I pay back that money? I'm then in the debt of those gangs. And so, there are real fears in terms of recidivism and real dangers of coming back. And that's not just a year or 2 or 3 afterwards, but that can go up to as much as a decade afterwards because of the structural conditions and lack of opportunities that are present in you know, a lot of the communities that these participants are coming from. Yeah, and I think that you know, some sort of retrospective would be really, really interesting to see how many people managed to stay out of gangs. I would say a good majority of them are still out, but you know, as I mentioned, some of the participants had already been out for a period, and so especially those whose exit was already relatively new, or was still relatively new, it'd be interesting to see if they managed to stay out.
Thank you, Darius. Betty had a follow-up question whether the gang members are writing their own stories.
And
are they writing stories about their lives?
I'm not sure I totally understand that. In terms of, do they
are the ex-gang members writing their own stories about their own agency of getting out of gangs? You know.
In that, do they have the platform to be able to speak about these things?
Yeah, to speak about it, to write it, you know, maybe a biography or something.
So yes and no. I mean, I think that gang participation and sort of the topic of gangs is something that people are really interested in, and so something that I say to a somewhat a degree of shame is that, you know, that there's a long lineup of journalists, researchers, videographers, and others that come to mine people's stories around the topic of gangs, and so in that way they do give people a platform to present their stories and their struggles. But really the benefits of something like that are not particularly well distributed, right? And so a book like this doesn't really make much money, and so there's no way of distributing the benefits of that. Like what I get is a certain reputational boost, and I can leverage that for my own career. But unfortunately, there's very little that can be done then in terms of you know, spreading those benefits to the participants. And I've seen, you know, not everybody, but there are those that researchers and journalists and others look to frequently, and you see them pop up in articles and in videos and in some really prominent media outlets. And you know, I've known them for a period of time, and despite the fact that their message gets out there, their story gets out there, you know, that their circumstances remain largely unchanged. And so, you know, platforming is not enough. I think that I don't know what the answer to this is, but it's something that I've reflected on, and as I say, do feel a certain amount of shame about, because we are leveraging and profiting from, you know, people's trauma, and it's done for the sake of obviously, you know, creating research ideas, theory, which can be brought to policy and practice, but the direct benefits of this aren't brought back to those that are the subjects of the research.
Yeah, very interesting. Absolutely. Thank you, Darius. So there's another question which echoes one of mine. Exactly. So the vet shoot wants to know, from a researcher's point of view, did you feel at any stage during the research that your own life could be endangered? Or now, after the release of the book, that you could be treated as an enemy?
I can't speak to the second part of the question. I think the feedback that I've gotten on the book has largely been good. I mean, that has been from participants who are for the most part out of gangs. In terms of within the context of research, I think largely, you know, I have the benefit of being treated with a certain level of benign interest. So a white face, a foreigner, people are keen to talk to you, and you know, almost vicariously are able to access your life through your interactions. And so generally I didn't feel threat. I'm also not a very sort of risk averse person, but I would say that there were instances where, you know, you can see how life in any of the communities that I was researching in, you know, despite the fact that violence isn't always present, you can see how it's always a possibility. And so we will be having some sort of interaction where we'll be drinking beers and you know, there'll be music playing, and suddenly there's just some sort of, you know, some sort of tension that emerges between two people, and then others pile on, and you know that there's a moment that's kind of hanging in the balance where, luckily for me, it didn't turn into anything serious, but there's been instances where I'd left and 5 minutes later somebody got shot or got stabbed or got beaten up. And so it gives you a sense of the precariousness of life and the precariousness of security in any individual moment. And I think that is something that is important for a researcher to understand. And it's not something that you can understand in the context of an interview and a conversation with somebody if you're speaking, in a room somewhere. But it's very much a lived experience. And, I, as I said before, have the benefit of exiting those communities and living in comfort and security and all of this. And so I feel only a fraction of the level of insecurity and dislocation that somebody that is in those circumstances all the time would, but at least it gives me a sense of that.
Thank you. I had a question from when you spoke about Rouen, and his story is very interesting. When you speak about violence being like a performance, and which is a very interesting idea. And I was wondering whether in your other research, maybe you have explored the phenomenon of the performativity of gang violence,
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that comes across the entirety of this story. So this idea that your identity is even embodied in a nickname, I think disaggregates your experience of the world and what you feel is expected of you in a particular time. And so as people were disengaging from gangs and leaving those personas and nicknames behind, they would also speak about how that was associated with a character, right? And so there's an external performance, and there's an internal experience of that performance where you have to suppress feeling and emotion and what would be called weakness or trust for other people. And all of that takes a huge toll. And you don't really realize, or I think the participants didn't really realize that often until they were coming out, and they had to come to terms with just, how much that character cost them. I mean, sometimes it was even obvious to them, where they would go out and they would engage in like really harrowing acts where they would go into enemy territory as the first person that was shooting, because that's what they learned. They're like, okay, well, actually, so I'm thinking specifically of a former hard living where his uncle taught him. He's like, well, it's actually easier to go in and be the person that does the first shooting. It's seen as a more dangerous thing, and you will gain status by doing that. But in fact, it's more dangerous to engage in the gang war that follows, because the enemy already knows. And so he would have to do these really sort of death-defying, risk-taking forms of violent performativity. I mean, it's not performativity because it is actual violence. And then he would come back and he said, I would fall asleep crying because I didn't see, there was any way out. This was a mask that I wore. This was a character that I had to engage in. And all of that gave him status in the gang. But his lived experience of that, his internal experience was one that was, was contrary to that, was emotional, was fragile, was nowhere near the puffed up persona that he created in the social settings in the gang world.
Yeah, thank you. There are a couple of comments coming up in the chat, but I think you would have access to this through the ASSAf office. Just something else that when I listened to you talk, and I was wondering about your personal relationships with these participants. So there was the other question about whether you feel threatened, but my other concern was whether you ever felt exploited by them, because they would take advantage of you being white and having access to other kinds of capital, or whether they felt exploited by you being white. Yeah, both ways. I wondered about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that comes up, and it's an issue. So in terms of whether or not other people felt exploited, there are indications that on in some cases that was the case. So for example, when the book came out, I've had people request the book, and then I've had to say to them, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not able to access this. And then, through others, I hear, well, Darius is sold out. He was here to sort of mine our stories, and then, hasn't come back and re-engaged with us in the same sort of way. And so, there is the definite possibility of that. It's not something that has come out that much, but you can see even in that sort of interaction that it exists. In terms of other people exploiting me, I think that I have access to certain social networks, and I can't fault somebody for trying to leverage their relationship with me in order to access that. And so if we are out somewhere and we're just essentially engaging in what is partly research and partly a personal relationship, and I have more money, then it's obvious that I might buy a meal or something like that. If I'm in the position to help somebody out with a job, which has happened once or twice, then I will do that. And this comes not at the beginning of research, but this comes sort of as research forms into something that is a little bit muddier and gray and borders on personal relationship. And I think there's a lot of questions there about impartiality and lack of bias. But then this is where you need to be able to kind of step back, interrogate, your own role as a research participant. And I mean, in a way, it actually, that familiarity creates the space for you to better interrogate some of the things that people are telling you, because as they tell their stories, there is kind of a romanticized version of some of those stories, right? And so you can push back on some of the explanations of violence and say, well, in fact, you do have a choice, or kind of scratch at the surface of what people are telling you, and that allows you to engage kind of a deeper conversation. It's incredibly complex and not something that I have a formula for. I think it took me a long time to kind of figure out what the right balance is, and even that is dynamic and shifting depending on the circumstance.
Thank you. There's a question that's very much related to this one. Annie wants to know whether the gender influenced the research outcome. Do you think your gender influenced the research outcome? I can't help but think that a woman would not have been able to get them to speak so candidly about insecurities behind their personas. Very interesting viewpoint. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have the benefit of being able to step into a community where, my security is not threatened in the same way that a female's would. The sexual violence and harassment are things that I don't have to think about in the same way. They're not a threat in the same way. I think, yes, that there's gender relations that allow men into spaces and men to interact with a hyper-masculine form of social space in a way that I don't think would be in the same way accessible to a female. And then I think on the other side of it, so I've written a paper on female participation in gangs, and specifically sort of female participation in street culture as a form of, like, especially through aggression. So not as kind of an adjunct to gangs, where they are an accessory to violence, but a subset of females that actively engage in sort of like frontline gang activities. And there was no way that I'd be able to have a candid discussion with the women in that particular sample about threats of sexual violence that they felt. So these aren't even things the topics that I was able to approach. We were able to kind of talk about those issues in a way that was abstract. So does it happen? Do people experience it? But in terms of their own experiences, obviously, like I don't think I would be in a position where I would even want to engage that for fear of re-traumatizing somebody. It's not my place to do that. But perhaps there's another researcher who is female, who has better training in that particular topic, who would bring out a fuller story of their particular experience. So gender is there all the time in different ways. And it can be managed, but you also need to understand the benefits and the limitations of access and then lack of access.
True. So Ekem had a question, which I think you've just answered. Were there any female gangsters or former gangsters among your participants? I think you've just spoken about the ones that were part of the project, and you've actually done another paper just on their stories. She also wants to know, did you at any point feel like you had to censor your work for security reasons?
No, not. I mean, there obviously there's questions of anonymity. So these are not stories that I'm able to associate with particular people, to the extent that my former research participants have come and participated in events and things like this. We obviously are not able to talk about the particularities of events that they've engaged in, especially as this relates to criminality. So I need to censor it in that sense. I don't think I need to censor it for my own sake, or at least I've never felt the need to do that. And then, yeah, in terms of female participation in gangs, I think it's an interesting topic, and much as disengagement is under-researched, so is female participation, and especially female participation as it relates to kind of those frontline activities. So there's, typically the way that females in Cape Flats gangs are associated is kind of as an adjunct. And so they may be accessories to violence, they will spy on another gang, they will hide drugs, they will take a gun after a shooting. Oftentimes they will be associated with gang members through some sort of romantic or sexual relationship. And that's very much sort of the stereotype of how females are included in that environment. But there also is a small subset of females who take on those street repertoires in a way that isn't necessarily overtly masculine or feminine. And so when I ask them, are you trying to be a man, or are you trying to distance yourself from your femininity? Obviously not asking it in that way, but the overwhelming sort of consensus is among them that, well, no, in fact, I want to be a boss, right? So it's not that I want to be a man, but I want to have everything that's associated with this person in power that holds, that holds the levers of the things that I want to access for myself. And so it's a very interesting dynamic, and that obviously is a reaction to their own sort of marginality and insecurity, and part of which is gendered, right? Because men are also seeking protection in a community which is insecure, but the protection that they're seeking from, it doesn't necessarily in the same way involve protection from sexual violence or harassment, or other forms of gender-based violence. And so there you can see how gender is at once flattened, or the insecurity around or gendered insecurity is once flattened with other forms of oppression, because you're trying to at once distance yourself from poverty, insecurity, part of which is gendered insecurity, discrimination, etc. But at the same time, gender is something that you can't escape.
You have mentioned power, and power is key in this conversation. So when I was reading your book, one of the things that I wondered about, and so this is a question I'm going to pose to you now. Those who were able to exit the gangs and manage to stay out of it, it's very clear from those life stories. They didn't just lose money or a middle-class lifestyle, the Porsche cars and everything. They lost power.
Yeah.
And so one of the big things I often wondered is, how did they renegotiate power in other spaces within the community? So obviously they've lost power within gangs, but as people, they still need to have some kind of power. So what other avenues of power were they able to renegotiate within the communities?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question and a difficult one. I think that, I think going back to personal relationships and being able to kind of like mine people's experiences, one of the questions that I would ask is, you've moved from a position of extreme power where you're making all sorts of money. So you have physical power, social power, economic power, and now you are, working as a janitor, where it takes you a full month to make what you would make in a few hours. And if somebody steps to you, then you don't have the gang to back you up. And so what does that do to you? I mean, on some level, you've in a way sort of constrained your outlook on life, in that you hope for something better, but what society allows you to step into after you've come out of a gang, you've tried to kind of aim high as best you could in the ways that you could, and now you're stepping into something else. And largely what people say is that they look for empowerment, so not power, but empowerment through different things, right? So family gives you a sense of empowerment, religion gives you a sense of empowerment, work to the extent that you can get it gives you a sense of empowerment. But as far as power goes, it's something that you have to be willing to forego, right? And so there are some that look to sort of engage roles of social activism, usually around disengagement from gangs, substance, things like that. And so that gives you a certain standing and power in the community. But otherwise, the conversation is really almost a balance between power and stability and security. And so what people say is that I'm willing to forego that power that I had, both economically and in terms of status and physical power, or power related to violence, because that's something that also is fragile. So that, it has power in the moment, but in a way it's kind of disempowering because it can be taken from you anyway at any time. Whereas now I don't have to look over my shoulder all the time. I don't have to sleep with a gun under my pillow, which are things that people have actually said to me. I can walk freely. Once that disengagement is sort of further along, and I'm empowered to live a stable, full life with my family, even though outwardly it might seem constrained and somehow smaller. And then still, hopefully, that hope exists that they might be able to hope for something better, aspire for something better, and in some way even use their story to leverage their story towards something better.
Thank you so much, Darius. It's almost time for me to hand over to Professor Crane Sudian, but I see there's one. Let's take this one last question before we hand over to Professor Crane. Was most of your research done on one-on-one or group settings? Were there any moments during your research that you thought the participants were embellishing or amplifying their stories, especially in group settings, to show a sense of bravado or one-upmanship? Quick answer.
So all of the 24 interviews were just one-on-one interviews that happened over a number of interviews. Otherwise, their discussions and bravado and embellishment are kind of inherent to street culture, to puff yourself up. But I think one of the good things about being in a place for a long time and having sort of multiple connections and not just accessing somebody through what they're saying, but having access in many ways to their family, community workers, et cetera, you're able to validate their stories. And so there was a relatively sort of rigorous, both formal and informal validation process to at least understand whether the trajectory of somebody's life is to be believed and the stories that we're hearing are to be believed.
Thank you, Darius. I will now hand over to Professor Crane Sudian to do the closure. Over to you, Crane.
No, thanks very much, Naomi. Thank you for managing this absolutely superbly. So big thank you to you, Darius, and to say to you that you have helped us here begin to enter a discussion which has so many dimensions and so many potentialities to help us come to understand South Africa a whole lot better. And so I'm just going to make some observations, closing observations in bringing to a close what I think has been a really significant opportunity for all of us. First of all, want to say thank you for your bravery. When I read your book, I landed on a page where you were describing a moment of tension when somebody was almost needling you, testing you, and you could see how easily that moment could have developed, gotten out of hand in a way which you would have had real difficulty in handling. And what you're talking about there is this incredible space of what this performativity is all about. But you have to keep your wits about you, and you kept your wits about you to bring us to this point where we're able to read what I think is a really important text that comes on top of just a handful of other people writing in this space. But my observations have got to do with morality and conscience, and the repeated way you're able to bring us into the space where these human beings, and let's think about them, colleagues, as human beings, they become all of these other labels that we attach to them as parts of very complicated socialization processes, but they're human beings. They're not born gangsters, just as people are not born into race or gendered identities. They become like that. And thank you for helping us see how all of this process unfolds, but can also be deconstructed and refolded into something else. And the key thing in that is this morality, this conscience, which is never absent in the way in which these folks have come across to you, have spoken to you. It's never absent. So even as that performance plays itself out, you hear how that person is constantly having to think and to evaluate the circumstances in which he finds himself. And it's that which I think is really the most important thing which comes out of this work, to help put in front of us that full amplitude of what is going on inside of somebody's head in these circumstances. And I think here just of how difficult that process of becoming, of formation is. When you think of, you said that of course not everybody in these circumstances is a gangster. The way in which the literature, which journalism tends to work, is to actually think that everybody is, but they aren't. Many of these people live in families where siblings go completely different routes, where you have one brother going one way and another brother going in the complete opposite direction. And this is what is important about this work. So our people are making lives for themselves, but it's this development of conscience, which I think is really important for all of us in the different spaces in which we work here. And I'm seeing in the gathering here online, there are colleagues from psychology, there are colleagues from sociology, there are colleagues from fields like criminology, there are literary theorists in the room here. And all of us here need to understand formation, come to terms with how this process of becoming arises and how we might assist in facilitating and developing the capacity, the possibilities for alternative ways of thinking. And it's a really important thing for us to do, because even though you're talking about 100,000 people here out of a population of, say, 4 million, it's 100,000 people too many. And of course, there are structural things which need to change and turn all of that around. But we need to also be depending on the agency of these people themselves. And it's that conscience thing that is really important. And thank you for bringing that into view, Dariusz, and leaving that as a space of engagement for all of us to deal with. So in closing, colleagues, thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to our ASSAf colleagues for facilitating all of this. Naomi, to you, as I've said, for really managing this in a wonderfully inclusive kind of way. And Dariusz, to you for your wonderful work, and may it get out into the public domain for public discussion in the ways that you hope that will happen. So thanks very much, colleagues, and this closes the meeting. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.